She was never the kind of person who drew attention. Her days were simple, quiet, filled with small rituals that brought her peace. Every morning, she would walk down to the shore, her boots sinking slightly into the wet sand as the waves whispered secrets around her feet. The world was calm there, the sky a soft blend of blue and gray, the ocean stretching endlessly before her. She would crouch low, searching for shells, each one different, each one carrying a story of its own. It was her way of finding focus, of keeping her mind steady in a place where strength was often measured in silence. No one ever thought much of her. She was polite, reserved, the kind of person who seemed to belong in the background. But that morning, something shifted. The sound of boots approached from behind, firm and deliberate. She didn't turn right away. She recognized the rhythm of command, the presence of someone who didn't just walk. He advanced. When she finally looked up, the figure that stood before her was unmistakable. A man in desert fatigues, his eyes sharp and calculating, stood watching her. His posture told the story before his words did. This wasn't an ordinary soldier. The way his hand rested lightly on his rifle, the steady, unbroken line of his stance, the faint glint of a patch on his shoulder, it all revealed what he was. Special forces. The kind of man who had seen too much, who carried a silence that came only from battlefields most people couldn't imagine. She straightened, brushing sand from her palms. He said nothing for a moment, just studied her. There was something almost curious in his expression, but beneath it, a quiet challenge burned. Finally, his voice broke through the ocean's hum, measured, low, but heavy with intent. You think you've got aim? The question didn't sound like an insult, yet it carried weight. She hesitated, unsure whether to respond or wait for what came next. His gaze didn't waver. Then, almost casually, he continued, 3,285 hits. Think you can handle that? The number hung in the air, impossible, absurd even. She thought she had misheard. But he wasn't joking. Behind him, two other soldiers watched with quiet amusement, their crossed arms and faint smirks saying everything they didn't need to voice. They had seen this kind of thing before, someone getting tested, pushed beyond what seemed reasonable. Only this time, it wasn't another recruit. It was her. He stepped aside and motioned toward the range set up nearby. A long stretch of open land, targets lined up in measured distances, glinting faintly under the early sun. The wind cut through with a cold edge. She looked at the rifle he carried, the way he handled it, and something inside her stirred, a mix of defiance and quiet resolve. She didn't know why he had chosen her. Maybe it was curiosity. Maybe it was arrogance. Or maybe, deep down, he wanted to see if there was anyone who could surprise him. She walked closer, her step steady. The men exchanged looks, but said nothing. The sniper handed her the rifle, the weight of it settling into her hands with surprising familiarity. Her fingers traced along the barrel, her eyes scanning the sights. It had been years since she last touched one, but muscle memory has a way of remembering what pride forgets. The sniper's expression changed slightly as he watched her check the balance, adjust her grip, and test the scope alignment. She wasn't fumbling. She wasn't pretending. Something in her demeanor shifted the air around them. The challenge was no longer a joke. The ocean breeze fell quiet for a moment, as though waiting. He gestured toward the first set of targets, his voice calm but firm. Let's see what you've got. Her first shot cracked through the stillness. The sound echoed against the cliffs. One hit, then another, then another. The men watching straightened, their smirks fading into focused silence. She didn't rush. Every movement was deliberate, her breathing synchronized with the pull of the trigger, her eyes fixed in a rhythm that came not from training manuals, but from something deeper, instinct. The sniper folded his arms, his expression unreadable now. He had seen rookies crumble under less pressure. Yet this woman, who just minutes ago had been collecting shells by the water, was moving with the precision of someone who belonged behind the scope. Each shot landed closer to perfection, as though she had been waiting for this moment her entire life. The other soldiers exchanged glances, their quiet amusement replaced by disbelief. The rhythm of her shots filled the air, steady, relentless, unstoppable. He called out distances, changed wind parameters, adjusted targets. She adapted instantly, without hesitation. The test that was meant to expose weakness was revealing something entirely different. Her hands didn't shake. Her focus didn't waver. The man who had come to challenge her now found himself watching, questioning, recalibrating everything he thought he knew about her. She wasn't just another quiet figure by the shore anymore. She was something else, something that couldn't be explained by rank, training, or reputation. The sound of each hit was more than just a bullet meeting its mark. It was a declaration, a quiet defiance written in precision and control. The transformation didn't happen in an instant. It began subtly, almost imperceptibly, like a ripple spreading across still water. The woman who once bent to gather shells from the sand was not the same person who now stood on the firing range. The moment she accepted the sniper's challenge, something dormant awakened within her. The calm of the ocean faded behind her as she entered a world of measured breaths, cold precision, and unspoken rivalry. Her fingers, once gentle and careful, now carried purpose and strength. The same patience she used to search for perfect shells had turned into razor-sharp focus. Each second seemed to stretch, and within that silence, she began to change. The men around her watched quietly, some with curiosity, others with skepticism. To them, she was still the quiet observer, the one who didn't belong among weapons or soldiers. But what they didn't see was that her composure was not weakness, it was control. She had spent years learning how to steady her heart when the world became chaotic. That calmness, once mistaken for fragility, was her weapon now. Every inhale steadied her. Every exhale cleared her mind. Transformation often hides behind repetition, and with each shot she took, her movements became more deliberate, her posture firmer, her resolve unshakable. The sniper, standing only a few feet away, began to sense it too. At first, he had thought it would be simple, a test, maybe a lesson in humility for someone who didn't know her limits. But as she fired, the pattern in her eyes changed. There was no hesitation, no nervous laughter, no fumbling. There was precision born of instinct. He recognized it immediately. The mark of someone who doesn't shoot to impress, but to prove something deeper to herself. He saw in her a reflection of what soldiers lose over time, purpose untainted by ego. The world around her shrank to the sound of the rifle's report, the movement of the wind, and the faint echo of each bullet meeting its mark. She didn't notice the growing silence among the onlookers. She didn't see the shift in their expressions as doubt slowly turned into respect. Her transformation wasn't just physical. It was something far more profound. It was the quiet shedding of the labels others had placed on her. The image of the delicate woman collecting shells faded, replaced by one of focus, strength, and composure under pressure. What had started as an impossible challenge was becoming a mirror of everything she had hidden away. For years, she had lived quietly, never needing to prove herself, never wanting to invite attention. But now, under the weight of this test, her restraint became her power. Each pull of the trigger stripped away another layer of uncertainty. She began to remember things she thought she had forgotten. The rhythm of breath before a shot, the way to read the wind, the discipline to let instinct guide over emotion. She wasn't performing. She was remembering who she was always capable of being. The transformation spread beyond her hands and eyes. It reached the very atmosphere around her. The soldiers who had been watching began to stand straighter. The sniper, once detached and composed, found himself intrigued. This was not the display of a recruit learning through luck. This was mastery resurfacing, quiet and unassuming, yet commanding in its presence. She wasn't loud about it, didn't boast or grin after each perfect hit. She simply reloaded and continued, as though her purpose had never been interrupted. Even the rhythm of her heartbeat seemed to align with the rifle's recoil. There was a sense of unity in her movement, mind, body, and focus blending into one fluid motion. The transformation wasn't about becoming someone new. It was about reclaiming what had been buried beneath years of silence. Her strength wasn't loud or aggressive. It was refined, precise, and unwavering. The sniper noticed how her breathing didn't quicken, how her shoulders remained relaxed no matter how distant the targets became. She had crossed an invisible threshold, moving from uncertainty into control. The shift wasn't lost on anyone. The soldiers who had once looked on with quiet amusement now watched with a kind of awe. They whispered among themselves, but kept their distance, unwilling to interrupt the moment unfolding before them. They could see it too, that this wasn't luck, wasn't coincidence. It was transformation through sheer focus and willpower. The air around her carried a weight now, one that demanded acknowledgement. As she continued to shoot, the sniper's challenge began to change meaning. It was no longer about numbers, no longer about proving something to him. It had become something internal, a battle between who she had been and who she was becoming. The woman who picked up shells for calm was now channeling that same patience into something far greater. She wasn't defying the sniper. She was redefining herself in front of him. Every movement, every decision, every precise hit was another step in that silent evolution. There was something hauntingly powerful in the way she remained still between shots. The steadiness, the deliberate rhythm, the unwavering gaze. It all spoke of a transformation that couldn't be taught in drills or measured in ranks. It came from experience, from quiet resilience, from the ability to stay composed when everything else demanded chaos. What began as a test of endurance was turning into a revelation, not just for the men watching, but for her as well. The transformation had taken root completely, and with each passing moment, it grew stronger, more defined, and impossible to ignore. Precision was not something that came from practice alone. It came from patience, from the ability to listen to silence and read the invisible patterns between heartbeats. As she took her position behind the rifle, it wasn't just her hands that moved. It was her entire being aligning with purpose. The world around her slowed, narrowed, and focused until all that existed was her breath, the distant target, and the faint whisper of the wind. She had learned long ago that true accuracy was not about control over the weapon, but over oneself. Her stillness was not emptiness. It was discipline carved through years of quiet observation and restrained strength. The sniper watched closely, arms folded, his trained eyes noting every small motion. He could see it, the way she inhaled slowly through her nose, the way she held that breath just long enough for her heartbeat to fall into rhythm, and the way she exhaled just as her finger brushed the trigger. It was the kind of precision only a few ever mastered, and fewer still could maintain under scrutiny. She did it effortlessly, not because she sought to impress, but because patience was already part of her nature. It was the same patience that had carried her through countless unseen battles of life, where calm was the only weapon she had ever needed. Each shot was deliberate. There was no rush, no falter, no waste of motion. She adjusted for distance instinctively, her eyes calculating without the need for words or numbers. The sound of each bullet leaving the barrel blended with the wind, creating a rhythm that only she seemed to understand. The targets fell one after another, and the soldiers nearby began to realize they were witnessing something that defied explanation. It wasn't brute strength or mechanical skill. It was grace under pressure, precision born from inner steadiness. The sniper shifted slightly, curious now, no longer testing but observing. He recognized that kind of focus. He had seen it before, on the faces of warriors who had nothing left to prove. Her patience was unnerving in its purity. Even when he tried to disrupt her timing, calling out sudden wind changes, adjusting targets at unpredictable intervals, she remained composed. Every change he introduced became part of her flow. Her movements adapted, subtle yet exact, her body responding before her mind had to think. That kind of reaction didn't come from training manuals. It came from deep awareness, from the kind of patience that could wait out a storm without blinking. There was no pride in her expression, no trace of satisfaction in her eyes. It was as though she had entered a realm where time and ego didn't exist. The only thing that mattered was the shot, the balance, the moment between breath and stillness. That moment was where her strength lived. She had always been patient, waiting for opportunities, for respect, for understanding. But now that patience had transformed into sharp precision. Every fraction of a second she waited before pulling the trigger held meaning. It wasn't hesitation, it was mastery over impulse. The onlookers began to murmur softly, unsure of what they were witnessing. To them, patience had always been seen as passivity. But here it was, weaponized, exact, unyielding. Her calm wasn't weakness, it was her edge. Every movement was a study in control. Her trigger finger didn't twitch. Her eyes didn't wander. Her focus was total. The sniper found himself lowering his guard without realizing it, drawn into the rhythm she created. He knew that kind of flow state. It was what marksmen spent lifetimes chasing. But to see it emerge so naturally from someone who had been underestimated moments before, it unsettled him in ways he couldn't describe. She didn't measure success by the targets falling. She measured it by how still she could remain, how much clarity she could maintain even as the wind shifted and the murmurs grew louder. Precision, for her, was not about perfection. It was about patience meeting purpose. Her breathing synchronized with the world around her, the soft crash of waves in the distance, the hum of tension in the air, the faint metallic echo of spent shells hitting the ground. Each detail became part of her awareness. She noticed everything yet allowed nothing to distract her. Her patience was her foundation, and from it rose a quiet strength. The sniper began calling out numbers faster, pushing her, trying to break her rhythm. But instead of faltering, her focus deepened. Her response time shortened. She didn't resist the pressure. She absorbed it, used it to sharpen her senses even more. That was the secret he had almost forgotten. True precision was not born from control, but from surrender. She wasn't fighting the conditions or forcing the moment. She was flowing with it, letting her stillness guide her aim. Those watching didn't know what to make of it. They had seen shooters who bragged, who barked, who thrived on adrenaline and dominance. But she moved differently. Every motion was quiet, fluid, perfectly measured. Her precision was art disguised as combat. It was patience turned into strength, and strength turned into rhythm. The sniper, once the challenger, now found himself studying her, not as an opponent, but as someone relearning what mastery truly meant. The shots continued, steady and unbroken. Each one carried the same calm intention, the same unwavering alignment between mind, body, and purpose. There was something sacred in the balance she created, something that even the soldiers, hardened and skeptical, could feel in their chests. It was as if every bullet carried a lesson. That precision was not speed, not control, not aggression. It was patience perfected through discipline and stillness, a silent power that needed no recognition to prove its worth. The laughter had been subtle at first, the kind that hides behind smirks and half-whispered words. They didn't mean harm, or so they told themselves. It was just the natural order of things, the way the strong looked at someone who didn't seem to belong. She had no medals on her chest, no visible sign of authority, no scars that spoke of battles fought. To them, she was out of place, fragile, an observer in a world built for those who thrived on aggression. But they had mistaken silence for weakness. They didn't understand that true power often hides behind restraint, and that strength doesn't always roar, it endures. When she took the rifle from the sniper, their smirks deepened. They saw someone trying to prove a point, someone stepping into a space too large for her. Yet as the minutes passed and the air filled with the rhythm of perfect shots, those quiet assumptions began to unravel. The mocking glances started to fade, replaced by something they weren't used to feeling, doubt. She didn't argue with them, didn't try to prove them wrong with words. Her defiance was wordless, carved into the air through every shot that hit its mark. It was not rebellion, it was revelation. Breaking stereotypes doesn't happen with grand speeches or dramatic gestures. It happens in silence, through the quiet dismantling of what people believe to be true. That's what she was doing now. Every bullet that struck the center of the target was another blow to the fragile armor of their assumptions. The same hands they had seen gently collecting seashells were now steadying a weapon with the precision of a master. The woman they had dismissed as delicate was now performing with an intensity they couldn't match. They began to see her differently, but the shift was slow, reluctant. It takes time for pride to yield to truth. The sniper himself was not immune to this realization. He had challenged her out of curiosity, maybe even arrogance. He had wanted to see the line where her composure would crack. But now, watching her move through the test with quiet confidence, he began to understand that he wasn't facing someone who needed validation. She was simply revealing what had always been there. Her silence, once easy to overlook, now carried the weight of command. Even the wind seemed to respect her pace, as though time itself bent to her rhythm. Every stereotype they had built around her, the quiet woman, the civilian, the outsider, was falling apart, one shot at a time. She didn't just meet the standard, she redefined it. They had measured strength by volume, by aggression, by display. She showed them that strength could exist in precision, in patience, in unshakable calm. There was no need for force when presence alone could shift the entire atmosphere. Her stillness was louder than their laughter had ever been. As the challenge went on, the soldiers' expressions began to change. The smirks were gone. The teasing whispers fell silent. What replaced them was something heavier, respect, perhaps even awe. They weren't watching a spectacle anymore. They were witnessing proof that ability has no shape, no gender, no boundaries defined by appearance. She had taken their expectations and turned them against them, not out of spite, but through the undeniable truth of skill. There was no anger in her movements, no desperation to prove them wrong. She was simply showing them what they had failed to see all along. The sniper's challenge, meant to test her endurance, had become something larger than either of them intended. It was no longer about accuracy or stamina, it was about perception. The soldiers watching began to question their own assumptions, not just about her, but about the silent power of those they had overlooked in their lives. They realized that the very qualities they had dismissed, patience, grace, quietness, were the ones that made her unshakable under pressure. Her focus didn't waver, even as the challenge intensified. She didn't need to glare or posture to command respect. It came naturally now, born not from dominance, but from quiet mastery. The range felt different, the air thicker with awareness. Every shot she took seemed to echo deeper, as though it carried more than sound. It carried meaning. Breaking stereotypes was never about confrontation. It was about truth unfolding so clearly that denial became impossible. Even the sniper, who had started this with the confidence of someone used to being unmatched, found himself watching with admiration. He understood now that the challenge had never been hers, it had been his. She hadn't needed to prove anything. He had needed to learn. Watching her work, he could see how balance replaced aggression, how precision overcame pride. It wasn't that she had become stronger. It was that they were finally seeing the strength she had always possessed. The silence that followed each shot was different now. It wasn't the quiet of dismissal, it was reverence. The soldiers no longer looked at her with condescension. They watched her as if witnessing something rare. She had broken through every label they had placed upon her without ever raising her voice. The stereotypes that once confined her now lay scattered across the firing range like empty shells. Reminders of how wrong they had been about where strength truly lies. Respect isn't given in places like this. It's earned, sometimes painfully, sometimes quietly, through moments that test the core of who a person is. For her, it didn't come from rank or reputation. It came from the undeniable weight of her actions, the kind that spoke louder than any explanation could. When she first stepped onto that range, no one had seen her as an equal. They saw a curiosity, maybe even an interruption. But as the challenge unfolded, their perception began to shift. Respect didn't rush in. It built slowly, growing with every precise shot, with every calm breath she took in the face of scrutiny. It wasn't the kind of respect born from surprise. It was the kind forged through realization. The sniper had been the first to feel it. At the start, his stance carried the quiet arrogance of someone who believed he had nothing left to learn. He had seen countless recruits come and go, some trembling under pressure, others breaking long before the final test. But this was different. The more he watched her, the more his certainty began to erode. There was a rhythm to her focus, a control he couldn't ignore. She wasn't reacting, she was anticipating. Every adjustment, Every correction she made spoke of instinct honed by experience. He found himself respecting her before he even realized it, caught between admiration and disbelief. The other soldiers began to notice it too. What started as curiosity turned into silent awe. No one spoke. No one dared to interrupt. The sound of the rifle had become something sacred now, steady, unwavering, purposeful. With each hit, the line between challenger and challenged blurred. She was no longer the subject of a test. She was setting a standard. Respect grew naturally, not forced or demanded, but earned through the simple, undeniable truth of mastery. They couldn't look away, not because she commanded their attention, but because her presence left no space for dismissal. Respect often comes when people realize they've misjudged someone. It's not always comfortable. It forces reflection. For the men watching her, it was a humbling experience. They had measured worth by power, by loud confidence, by the visible signs of strength they had been taught to recognize. She shattered those definitions without saying a word. Her calmness was unshakable, her discipline beyond question. What they had mistaken for fragility was something far rarer, control under fire, both literal and emotional. The sniper adjusted the challenge again, extending the distance, shifting the wind angles, adding complexity in hopes of finding her limit. Yet she adapted effortlessly, her focus deepening with every new obstacle. The harder the test became, the steadier she grew. Respect, once hesitant, began to take root fully. There was no doubt left now. She belonged there as much as anyone, perhaps more. She wasn't just keeping up with them. She was surpassing them, not through dominance, but through quiet excellence. Even as the temperature rose and the hours stretched, her movements never lost their precision. The sweat on her brow didn't distract her. The murmurs behind her didn't reach her. The only thing that existed was the next shot, the next small victory that built upon the last. She didn't look for acknowledgement. She didn't need it. The respect she was earning wasn't about recognition. It was about understanding. Those who had doubted her were now learning from her without realizing it. Her composure became a lesson, her silence a form of teaching. The sniper began to lower his guard. He stopped testing her and started studying her. Every small detail fascinated him. The steadiness of her posture, the deliberate pace of her breathing, the patience in her gaze. He had spent years perfecting his own craft, but what she displayed wasn't the product of repetition alone. It was something deeper, respect for the weapon, for the process, for the moment itself. She wasn't just performing. She was connecting with something beyond competition. That realization softened the pride that had driven him at the beginning. He began to see her not as an opponent, but as an equal. The atmosphere around the range changed. The mocking tone that had filled the air earlier was gone, replaced by quiet focus. The soldiers who had once watched with doubt now stood straighter, eyes fixed on her every move. They weren't just witnessing skill, they were witnessing integrity. The respect they felt wasn't born of shock, it was born of acknowledgement. They were seeing what true composure under pressure looked like, what it meant to embody discipline rather than perform it. When she reloaded, her movements were smooth, deliberate, almost graceful. The rifle became an extension of her intent, every motion carrying the same quiet authority. She didn't seek approval, but it followed her nonetheless. Even the sniper's final commands carried a different tone now, not challenge, but reverence. He no longer needed her to prove herself. She already had. The range had fallen silent except for the crack of her shots, each one landing with unerring accuracy. Respect had come full circle. It was no longer about her earning theirs. It was about them realizing they should have given it from the start. Through discipline, patience, and unwavering focus, she had dismantled their doubts and replaced them with belief. In a place where power was often loud, she had shown that true strength could be silent, precise, and deeply human. The respect she commanded wasn't temporary. It was the kind that lingered, the kind built on truth that could no longer be denied. There are moments that split time into before and after, moments that don't need words, only silence to mark their weight. The air was thick with that kind of silence now. The challenge that had begun as a spectacle had turned into something no one could have predicted. The last few shots echoed through the open field, and each one carried a gravity that was felt more than heard. The soldiers stood motionless, their earlier laughter long forgotten. The sniper's expression had changed completely. What had started as a test of skill had become a moment of realization. Everyone could feel it, the sense that something had shifted permanently. This wasn't about accuracy anymore. It was about witnessing a turning point in how they saw her, and perhaps even how they saw themselves. The rifle rested quietly in her hands, the barrel still warm, the scent of gunpowder faint in the wind. The targets in the distance bore the evidence of perfection. No misses, no hesitation, only precision carved into steel and silence. The sniper, the man whose reputation stretched across missions and stories whispered in training camps, found himself standing still, the challenge gone from his eyes. What replaced it was recognition. He wasn't watching a competitor. He was standing before someone who had changed the narrative entirely. Moments like these redefine what respect means. They erase the lines drawn by rank, experience, or expectation. The woman who had begun her day picking up shells by the water had done something no one else could have anticipated. She had transformed perception itself. The soldiers who once watched with skepticism now found themselves silent witnesses to something extraordinary. They weren't just watching a display of skill. They were watching legacy being written, quietly, deliberately, without a single boastful word. The wind swept softly across the range, carrying with it the echoes of the final shot. No one spoke. No one needed to. Every pair of eyes fixed on her carried the same expression, a mixture of disbelief and admiration. The sniper's challenge had been met not with defiance, but with composure. And that composure had conquered everything: doubt, pride, expectation. She hadn't just passed a test. She had rewritten what it meant to be tested. He took a slow step forward, his boots pressing into the dirt, his gaze locked on her. The man who had once stood as the embodiment of precision now found himself humbled by a presence that transcended his own measure. There was no need for words between them. The respect that flowed through that moment was unspoken, but it filled the air like something sacred. It wasn't about who had won or lost. It was about understanding that true strength doesn't announce itself. It simply exists, steady and undeniable. The soldiers around them began to shift, almost hesitantly, as though afraid that movement might break the spell. They weren't looking at her with curiosity anymore. They were looking at her with reverence. What they had seen couldn't be undone. They had witnessed grace under pressure, strength without aggression, confidence without arrogance. They had seen a kind of power that couldn't be taught in manuals or drills. It was something innate, something that came from experience, from pain, from patience, from everything unspoken that builds a person into more than what they appear to be. For her, there was no sense of victory. She didn't need it. The moment wasn't about triumph. It was about truth. The challenge had stripped away everything unnecessary, leaving behind only the essence of who she truly was. All the noise, the assumptions, the quiet dismissals, they no longer mattered. What remained was clarity. She stood steady, not because she needed acknowledgement, but because she had already found peace in what she had done. The sniper exhaled, his eyes softening as he studied her. He had spent years defining what excellence meant, shaping it through training and discipline. But now, standing before her, he realized that excellence wasn't always loud or visible. Sometimes it was quiet, patient, hidden until the right moment. He had challenged her to prove herself, but instead, she had reminded him of something he'd forgotten. The reason he had picked up a rifle in the first place, the purity of focus untainted by pride. The sun hung low, casting long shadows across the ground. The shells scattered near her boots glinted faintly in the fading light, each one a silent marker of what had just transpired. The soldiers didn't cheer or speak. They simply stood still, as though unwilling to disturb the balance that had settled over the place. Even the waves in the distance seemed softer, slower, in rhythm with the calm that followed the storm. In that silence, everything had changed. The story that had started with doubt now lived as legend among those who witnessed it. The range, once just a field of competition, had become the stage for transformation. They would remember not the number of hits, but the feeling that came after, the stillness that follows revelation. The sniper had issued a challenge meant to expose limits, and in doing so, had uncovered something limitless. The moment had become larger than the test, larger than them both. It had become the instant where skill met soul, where respect was no longer earned but shared, and where legacy began without a single word spoken.